living at a critical moment. With the election of Donald Trump,
we are going to build a great border wall.
Brexit.
Brexit must mean control of the number of people who come to Britain from Europe.
Hail our people, hail victory!
And the rise of nationalist movements, even here at home.
Alternative Right was born in an apartment near Yonge Street in Toronto, Canada.
As countries splinter and borders close, it's time for us to ask, what makes a nation?
We continue to demonstrate that we truly believe that diversity is a source of strength.
Politics and art have always been linked, from ancient Greece to Dada, from Kent Monkman to Beyonce. Whether through political satire,
bad hombres, bad boys, what you gonna do?
Refusing to make an appearance at an award show in protest of policies. Artists are telling stories that define national identities, or risking their lives to make change. Tonight, 4 of Canada's largest cultural organizations come together to present a conversation about the most urgent issues facing our world today: nationalism, reconciliation, migration, and the role of art in today's changing world. Christy Belcourt is an award-winning visual artist whose intricate paintings present a vision for a world that connects people and land through Indigenous wisdom. She initiated Walking with Our Sisters, a project that honors the lives of missing and murdered Indigenous women across North America. Belcourt is also making waves in the fashion world with her collaboration with the House of Valentino. She designed the 2015 Pan Am medals and has been an outspoken critic of Canada's sesquicentennial celebrations. Junot Diaz is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, born in the Dominican Republic and raised in New Jersey. He explores the American immigrant experience through the written word. When Junot isn't writing, he's using his platform to fight for social justice causes. In 2009, Diaz became persona non grata in his home country for speaking out against the deportation of Haitian immigrants. And what he says has resonance with some of the world's most influential figures, including President Barack Obama, who earlier this year named Diaz as one of his favorite writers. David Adjey is one of the most influential architects of our time. Born in Tanzania to Ghanaian parents, this British innovator has emerged as an international leader through projects that combine visionary design with social impact. David's projects include the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened in Washington, D.C. last year to international acclaim. The building tells the story of a nation through the African American experience, and the unprecedented demand for tickets is a testament to the power and potency of David's vision. Paul Gross is one of Canada's most celebrated and well-known actors and filmmakers. Gross first became internationally known as the face of the RCMP, portraying Constable Benton Fraser on the TV series Due South. Cut! Since then, he's become one of Canada's most popular and well-regarded filmmakers. His most recent films, Passchendaele and Hyena Road, explore the impacts of war on Canadian lives, highlighting our nation's history, and through the stories he tells, shaping our collective identity. The Art Gallery of Ontario, Massey Hall, CBC Arts, and Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, with the support of Jonas and Linda Prince, present Creative Minds. Give a round of applause once again for Whitehorse. They're amazing. Love them to bits. This is a real pleasure to be back here. We did this last year, and it was a fun conversation about big, prickly issues with big brains, and it worked out so well. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be back here again. It takes a lot of work and a lot of support to make something like this happen. We want to begin by thanking, as you heard, the supporters of this series, Jonas and Linda Prince, who came up with the vision for this series, as well as the support to make it happen. You ready? Here we go. Please welcome our extraordinary panel: David Adjey, Christy Belcourt, Junot Diaz, and Mr. Paul Gross. Thank you all for being here. These are interesting times, turbulent times, tricky times. We have a lot to talk about, but I thought we would start just by kind of getting a look at how you're doing. Junot Diaz, how is life in Trump's America?
I mean, it depends who you ask, right? There's certain groups of people who they're just like, this shit is wonderful. But for the most of us, it's incredibly trying. And, you know, individuals, like how am I doing is not really as interesting as how are certain communities doing. I'm sort of a member of kind of an immigrant community that faced a lot of deportation under the Obama administration and faces what looks to be even more deportation under the Trump administration. I'm a member of the African diaspora who grew up in a poor urban community, and you can only imagine what we're thinking is going to happen. So it's a time of much trial. But at the same time, there's also a tremendous amount of activity of people coming together, trying to organize, attempting to resist, creating new solidarities and new communities. So things are jacked up, but people are fighting, and it's the most you can ask at this moment.
David, you just flew in this afternoon. You flew in from Paris. French election is on Sunday. People know what happened in Paris in front of along the Champs-Élysées, and in the wake of that, I wonder what life is like for you these days.
Life is it's getting complicated, more complicated. I think the French condition is really talking about how Europe is really still struggling to kind of deal with this notion that it thought it kind of had sort of beautifully gone past, and this idea of a kind of a nationalism which is continually sort of revealing its problematic sides seems to kind of keep coming up. And I think it's making it difficult for the way in which those of us whose families kind of came to Europe from Africa or from the Caribbean, etc., and have sort of sought to kind of be part of the kind of moral identity of Europe. That was the attraction to sort of most of the immigrants that I know came to Europe. It's been really traumatic because in a way what we're reversing away from is not from the kind of the ideal of what a nation is about, but to some kind of tribal idea, which is then deeply problematic.
Christy, for you, what are these turbulent, tricky, rocky waters like for you?
Well, I think there's two things kind of going on, and one is that we're looking at a rise in climate change, and this is really threatening all life on the planet. And then at the same time, we're looking at the rise of nationalism and multinational corporations taking their seat in government. And then at the same time, indigenous nations, in this country at least, are in the process of rebuilding. And there's a beautiful movement that's happening on the ground in rebuilding and a resurgence movement to rebuild our nations back from the genocide of 150 years. Yeah.
We have a lot to talk about when it comes to that.
Yeah.
Paul Gross, last but not least for you, what are these times like? What's it like being you right now?
I don't know, I suppose I feel like most people that we've all been kind of slightly traumatized. It felt as though all of the things that we knew, whether we thought they were good or bad, has suddenly shifted. And I think I'm having a hard time kind of encompassing what that shift is, because each day seems to bring a brand new, impossible to understand thing. And I really have got to get rid of Twitter, because I wake up in the morning and it's like, what? He said what? And I follow that. It's overwhelming at times. I mean, on a kind of work note, it's the strangest thing, because I've been working on a television show that's quite long, and it's involved with the surveillance state and the tension between the need to protect citizenry and the rights of the citizenry to have privacy. And it was conceived of when the assumption kind of was that power would continue in its normal progression and Clinton would be the president. We didn't actually conceive of it with the possibility of electing someone who might become a fascist. So it's kind of upended everything. And I have a feeling like that's happening everywhere, that the assumptions that we had are are being flipped, and we're kind of all slightly not sure of what's next. But it's frightening, I think, a lot. There are great signs of resistance and response, but it's also scary.
We want to talk about nationhood and art and the collision between the two and what art can do to help build a nation or heal a nation or repair a nation. But I think it would be interesting just to spend a couple of minutes with each of you on your art and how it's received and the reactions to it and what it is that you're doing. It was interesting. In January, Junot, you got a call to go to the White House.
Yes.
Your books are read by people all around the world. I love them. The world loves them. People in this room love them. And it turns out that the former president loves them as well. What was that like?
Well, that was strange because I spent like all 8 years of the Obama administration just bagging on Obama. I was like super critical. I mean, on the one hand, as a person of African descent, Obama's election was absolutely historical. It meant the world to us. But on the other hand, I mean, Obama was kind of a standard neoliberal sort of Mandarin, and, his immigration politics sucked, and his sort of, love of corporations sucked. So it was a strange moment for me because I realized that my curiosity as a writer completely outweighed my sort of political purity. I was like, yo, I'm going. I was like, screw it, And it was the last days before Trump.
Did you say any of that stuff to him? Because he talked about how your books, what did he say? That they helped him maintain balance. So did you raise any of the things?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, he was like, oh, that dude. Like, he was like, oh, yeah, you. I'm like, oh, man. So I expected him to say some crazy shit, but he was very kind, and so I kept my mouth shut. And to be honest, there wasn't very much time to speak. It was a group of us, and it was only, 48 hours, 72 hours before Trump took over. So all of us were shellacked.
I was going to say, what was the mood like in the room? Shellacked is a great word. What was the mood like in that room, knowing that the trucks, the moving vans are loaded and ready to roll?
Yeah, it was dire. I think the assembled writers, we all looked like someone had stolen our moms. He was peppy. I have to tell you, he was peppy. He was like, no, for real. He's like, y'all bagged on me for 8 years? Have some, So, yeah.
There may be more to that conversation. We may come back to that. Wild times for you, David. You, in addition, congratulations on the top 100 for Time Magazine, most influential people in the icon category. Also knighted, sir. And you're involved in helping to build this extraordinary building in Washington. I was just down in DC to see the Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall. And it's astonishing. It's astonishing, the building, it's astonishing, the scenes in the building and the people who were there. I could ask for an hour about that building, but I wanted to know, when you look in at it now that it's finished, what do you see?
What's amazing to me is the way in which this building, which had no precedent, really a lot of people thought wouldn't work. It really sort of works against typical museum sort of layouts and the way you're supposed to do things, is completely embraced by people. They sort of have a natural relationship to it. They wait where they're supposed to wait, and they enjoy the building. And it's extraordinary feeling to be part of the team that sort of made that building.
Is it, it's a memorial, it's a museum, it's a celebration, it's all of those things at the same time. How do you categorize what that space has become?
No, I think it's actually it's those three things. I think it's a museum, it's a memorial, and it's also a monument. And it oscillates between all those things because of its landscape, but also because of the kind of extraordinary history that it's having to kind of negotiate. So the brief is make a museum, but hidden in the brief is, by the way, this might be a place where a lot of people will come just to kind of acknowledge their presence on the front lawn, to be acknowledged as citizens in full light rather than being hidden behind the sort of front porch.
There's a lot of waiting. You talked about that. I mean, when you go inside, you wait. I waited for a couple of hours to get into the galleries with people from all over the United States.
You know?
And they laughed, they cried, they told stories. Nobody was angry, but there was this, something was going on.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
How do you engineer that?
Well, I mean, we wanted it so that there were spaces where people could congregate and see each other. And actually, we sort of made the main concourse a space where, from the landscape, in the concourse, coming down it, you see people ascending, descending, walking to the park. It's a kind of, it's a place where you see all walks of life. And the thinking is that you don't feel that you're in a hermetic box and that you're kind of in an exclusive place, but you're connected to America, you're connected to the diaspora. And I think that people just instinctively feel it, and that's been really profound.
We'll come to the 150 and the Resistance 150 work that you're doing, Christy, a little bit later on. But I wanted to ask you about a couple of the things that you have going on. One was the Walking with Our Sisters project. This was created in 2012. The force of it is extraordinary. Can you describe what that project is?
Well, for anybody who doesn't know, and I wouldn't believe that there's anybody who doesn't already know that there are over 1,400 murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people in this country in the last 30 years alone, never mind the last 500. And so Walking with Our Sisters is a crowdsourced project that is a commemoration with the sole purpose to honor the lives of the women and girls and Two-Spirited people who are either missing or who have been murdered. And there's over 2,000 pairs of moccasin tops, which we call vamps, so that's just the tops, in this commemoration, and it's going to run for seven years until 2019, and it goes from community to community, and there's vast groups of volunteers who come together to organize to bring it into their community, and so it's involved thousands of people, and I think there's something like 60,000 people or more have gone to see it so far, and it's very much centered on ceremony and very much grassroots. It's not about raising awareness, it's not about anything political, it's only just the act of coming together and honoring the lives, to say that every single life that was taken is worthy of that honoring and that lifting up.
Similar to what David's been able to achieve in that space in the museum. I mean, there's a collective effort, there's a collective spirit. What does that say to you when people come together like that?
I think it says that that people have really good hearts, people are kind, people are compassionate, by and large, and they want, we all were feeling it. We're all feeling it, the losses in our communities. And the beautiful thing is that a lot of people who put the vamps in were non-native people as well. And so it wasn't exclusive in terms of everybody's compassion and the outpouring of love that they were showing. It's really quite moving.
Most people, I think, know you, Paul, as the Mountie.
Yeah.
That's not a bad thing. You have played characters that, I mean, they've been broad and diverse, but they have been, I think it's fair to say, unabashedly Canadian. There's a prime minister, there's a curler, there's an RCMP officer. What does it take to play a Canadian?
You have to have a passport. That's the first thing. And you have to be able to wear that red uniform, which actually most people would prefer not to, because it's kind of brutal. Seriously, I don't really know. And it's not by design. I don't think that I've ended up playing Canadian characters. I think they all seem to inhabit aspects of stories that I'm interested in. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to stay here and work. And as I said, it's not really, I suppose I can look back at it now and kind of see, well, yeah, that's odd. I've played all of these things that that seem to reflect aspects of us, but I suppose it's because I'm kind of interested in us, or more interested in what we are about. And those characters, of course, going to end up being Canadian.
One of the great examples of that, about what we are about, is Passchendaele. And the work that you poured into that, inspired in part by the story of your grandfather. You have said that this nation was forged in some ways, or in many ways, in those battles, in the trenches and beyond. Why? We've just come out of the 100th anniversary commemorations of Vimy Ridge. Mm-hmm. What does that mean when you say that a nation was forged in that battle?
I think a sense of Canada, the entity of Canada, understanding itself as an independent body, something that was an agent separate from the United Kingdom, was really forged in the course of the First World War. And to some extent, actually at Vimy, although it's been somewhat mythologized, but at Vimy we fought as an independent, we were under our own command. And the battle was successful, as opposed to the English failures at it and the French failures. And it did have an impact on us at home. I think furthermore, the war itself was enormous, and it took enormous amount of our resources, both in manpower and in materiel. Everybody, it was a total war. Everybody was engaged in it. We sent almost 10% of our population. So if we were to put our contribution in or sacrifice in the First War into modern context, say in Afghanistan, we would have sent 3 million people and 300,000 would have been killed. It blew a hole through almost every single aspect of Canadian society. And you go into small towns and you see the cenotaph, and it'll have long lists of people with the same last name. So clearly whole families were decimated. It was a time where the whole world, as a consequence, had to kind of redefine itself. It knocked out Orthodox religion or orthodoxy for quite a long time. It utterly changed art, and all of those, and gave birth to new empires and destroyed others. And all of that also happened for us. So I think it was a formative and pivotal turning point in how we think about ourselves.
That idea of redefining what a nation is, I mean, we're in this right now, right? You have Brexit, you have the French elections, you have this idea of countries making themselves great again, taking their country back. You have Canada 150. There is a conversation about who we are and what makes a nation. What are the ingredients to make a nation, Junot Diaz?
Well, I mean, that's a highly contested question. There's as many answers as people who can ask the question. When we're looking at what's going on in our current context, we're dealing with a rabid form of white supremacy that links all of these sort of situations together, whether we're talking about Brexit, whether we're talking about what's going on in France. When I think of what makes a nation, I always think of the counter nation. A nation is made up not about its attributes that it shares, its common languages, its common histories, its silences, and who are left out of the formula. In many ways, for me, is how nations assemble themselves. Nations are very antagonistic. They pick enemies, they pick borders, they create borders, they create characters and mythologies that exclude. And I always think that the nation is its silences, the nation is its exclusion. And for someone like me in the art that I do, it's disavowed dead. Because the nations love to create cenotaphs for its good dead, the dead that it recognizes, the dead that want to help perpetuate its project of the nation. But there's also an enormous population of its disavowed dead, the victims of this national project, the people who are decimated because of the national project. And so I tend to define the nation by who's on the other side of the bayonet, and who doesn't get a tomb, and who doesn't get memorialized, and who doesn't get mourned. And yet that's as much a part of what a nation is as whoever we decide to toast on whatever holiday.
You're nodding as he said all of that, David.
Yeah, no, I think that you've just really kind of you've speared the heart of the conversation, really, because I think there is a kind of mythology that the nation is about the border, there is a mythology that the nation is about the language or the passport. And in fact, you know, the notion of the nation is really a 19th century construction. It's really a recent idea. You know, the notions of nations as identities like that were really city-states, which were very kind of different ideas to what we've kind of constructed now. And what we've constructed now really kind of pushes us into really, you know, sometimes really good areas where it kind of allows identities and allows difference to kind of find a commonality under a kind of, what I think a moral code. I define a nation as something that has a kind of moral consciousness and a moral code, a kind of a guide that allows us to kind of, you know, move past all our personal issues towards a kind of collective good, or collective growth, or collective edification. You choose the word that kind of allows you to propel it. And I think that if we are not careful, we sort of construct what the notion of the nation for me is really useful when it really kind of is about bringing us towards something else in a way. I think the nation is almost a kind of a stopgap on the way to something. It was almost constructed to stop us kind of, to kind of allow us to kind of come into groups and to really, to use it as a device to egg each other on to get better. If nations come together and kind of use their moral codes to test each other's moral codes to make things better, it's a great thing. When it becomes a kind of system to create walls and divisions and isolation, I mean, there are about 8,000 nations in the world. Are we all going to have nations? This is just crazy.
Paul, how does that square with what we were just talking about? I mean, not so much directly with Passchendaele, but I mean, this idea that a nation in many ways is built around this ostracization, of exclusion, of us and them.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately that's very often the history of almost all nations. And I think if I think about Canada, there's just something particularly odd about how Canada came into the shape that it's in. And it does seem to me that, you know, the entity that we call Canada has just been unfolding and changing, and it's evolving and is not finished. And I think in part it can't be finished because it was never set in stone. We don't have any sort of foundation myth. We haven't elevated the fathers of confederation up into some pantheon, you know, alongside Odin and Zeus. In fact, most of us wouldn't even know what their names are, whoever it was that signed the document that created this entity called Canada. And that if it's viewed in sort of the long run, we have gradually, it seems to me, slowly expanded the enfranchisement of all citizens into participation. We are a long way away from ever finishing it, if such a thing can be done, but that has been sort of the movement. And I was really struck when I was thinking about this the other day about John Ralston Saul's book, A Fair Country, of a few years ago. There was something in there that he said about the three tent poles of Canadian character or ethos were, obviously there's the French pole, the English pole, and the third pole is First Nations. And he said, that's how we began this meeting of these three poles, and that we have lost contact with that, suppressed it, the long history of atrocity, and that we need to return to that. And I feel that where we are in Canada right now is an extraordinarily important hinge or turning point in this odd unfolding history. And it, you know, for me, I started to see this shift with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and I think that was shattering to many Canadians, the horrors of the residential school system, that somehow we did not know this broadly. And I was personally ashamed at my ignorance, and ashamed at the national ignorance. I have high hopes and some optimism for the inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women, and I think that our eyes are going to open, I hope, and that we will have some urgency, be compelled to seek remedy and to make amends. And I think there is some optimism for that because of our odd plasticity and our odd absorbance and our capacity. And that, I mean, I might be nuts, but I am hopeful, and I think that sets us apart or makes us unique.
Christy?
The idea of nations.
Oh, there's so much to say here.
It's a good thing that you have a microphone.
There's so much to say. So, okay, I don't want to forget about the notions of nations, so I'll begin there and then I'll go into the other things. So, first of all, I'm a Michif woman, I'm a Métis woman, I'm an Indigenous woman. There are over 50 Indigenous nations in this country. My people my ancestors were buffalo hunters, buffalo people. We have ceremonies, songs, and respect for the buffalo, so much so that we referred to the buffalo as nations, as a nation. We consider the birds to be nations. We consider the trees to be nations. Our view of nations is so much bigger and so different than just to assume that human beings are the only ones. We always assume that human beings are the top of the food chain, and yet we are at the bottom. We're at the bottom because nothing needs us to survive, and we need absolutely everything else. And so I will say this, that Canada was born on the coveting, the desire for Indigenous lands, and then the dispossession of Indigenous people from our lands. That is what happened. That is how Canada came about. It was through the genocide of Indigenous people. And if we do not reconcile that, then there will never be reconciliation in this country. And when I say this, and I mean this with the greatest respect, Indigenous nations want our lands back. We want our sovereignty. We want our self-determination and our God-given right to decide for ourselves with our own laws how we are going to proceed and govern ourselves. So do not refer to Indigenous people as Canadians. Do not think that we can come under the umbrella of Canada. There needs to be a reckoning in this country of our lands, because the entire fallout is murdered and missing Indigenous women from the dispossession, the increased suicide of youth that we're facing. More children are in care right now in the child welfare system, being stolen from their families, more Indigenous kids than were ever in the residential school era. Our languages are in crisis, and the government plays poverty politics with our communities to broker deals with multinational corporations, and they end up polluting our lands. Now, I will say this, though, that we have an obligation to each other to continue to respect each other's position. I want Canadians to think about how are you going to release the Crown lands? How are you going to release the lands back into our possession? And to imagine a different country, because empires rise and empires fall, and the borders of Canada will change. And how can we see and imagine a different country where we have our own lands, our own sovereignty, and our own places, not under Canadian laws anymore? And how can we go forward, all of us, to fight climate change and the takeover of the world from multinational corporations who do not care about me and they do not care about you? How are we going to save the human species and all species of it, all other species? Because Mother Earth will go on without us unless we do something. And all of that feeds into Brexit, but I'll leave it there.
No, but it's because it's...
Yes, it
does. It speaks to that idea of what it means to belong to a nation and what it means to disbelong. Do you know what I mean? That there are people who are in and there are people who are out, even if they are in the same physical space, that some feel welcome, some feel don't feel welcome at all. When you came to the United States as an immigrant when you were 7 years old, is that right?
Yes.
What did you learn as an immigrant about what it means to belong to a nation?
Well, but I think this perfectly dovetails into our conversation, because there's one of the things about white settler colonies is that there is this outstanding and profound question of the dispossession and the disposition of stolen lands. And immigrants play a very interesting role in this, because, you know, as someone who comes from one of the earliest conquest sites, the Caribbean, yeah, and then ends up immigrating to the United States, I learned on both sides of that transition, on both sides of that trip. First, in the Dominican Republic, you're living in a place where people make explicit the history that, hey man, all of these names around here, this was an indigenous community. And you're a kid and you're like, well, where are the indigenous folks? They're like, well, Spaniards killed them all. And what's left is fragments right now in the Caribbean. And then you come to the United States, and of course, you learn the history, completely distorted history. And I think that for me, what ends up happening as an immigrant is that you often acquire, in a desperate desire to belong, the just nonsense hegemonic codes. You learn all of the ridiculous false histories of the society, which immigrants are so desperate to belong. And so they're like, oh, you know, this is a wonderful country, there's all these opportunities, all these wonderful things are happening. And let me tell you, when you're a kid and you don't know what's happening, you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, it's real easy to think that what you're learning at school is very, very, you know, it's accurate and useful. There's a second education that happens, and the education of one's experience, of one's real experience as a person of color, a person of African descent, as a poor person. And so I ended up learning I studied at two curriculums simultaneous. Yeah. The curriculum of the society, which was complete nonsense and was pretty much a lie, and then the curriculum that we were experiencing, that in fact we were living out with our bodies, which was, for me, very, very useful.
You've said that you never stopped being an immigrant. I mean, even you've become an American citizen, but you've said that you never really stopped being an immigrant.
Well, does that kind of experience of rejection, marginalization, racism, being called every kind of N-word that exists, does that disappear simply because you get older? Does it disappear in your community? Does it disappear in your family? I think some people think they can transcend an experience like immigration, and there's people that think they can transcend race. You know, but I'm not down. I'm just, yeah, do you, but that's not me, you know?
David, what about for you? Does that square with your own experience?
No, it completely squares.
Yeah.
It's laughable to think people believe that they can transcend race.
Yeah, I got an uncle.
Do you feel like you belong to, I mean, you spend so much time, like a citizen of airplanes probably, but do you feel like you belong?
No, I think that there's another condition, you know, I mean, the privilege of what I'm sort of lucky enough to be able to do is that I'm able to, I'm able to kind of connect to different parts of the identity of, the idea of the nation that I believe in. And the nation that I believe in, you know, and I keep going back to it, is a kind of moral structure. And in a way, for me, the notion of a nation is no longer interesting as a kind of geography. So it's, for me, about a series of groups and people that exist in different parts of the world who share this structure. And that becomes much more interesting for me as a kind of structure. And in a way, I'm lucky enough to be able to go into those worlds.
How does that play into the work that you're doing? I mean, you're somebody who literally builds
in different places.
In nations, and you're building nations. You think about the museum in Washington.
Yeah.
There's a nation that's captured in there as well.
Yeah, but it's the nation it's the nation of the mind, not the nation of a kind of blood. It's not the nation as the sort of Latin, it's not about a kind of club. It's really the nation of the human species as a kind of bigger idea, which is kind of what I'm extremely interested in. And I think architecture is part of the construction that creates the separation, creates the apartheid, creates the kind of code which kind of segregates, separates, and actually structures the kind of the horrors that nations can produce, empires can produce.
As a country, we aren't, often comfortable with nationalism. We aren't comfortable with waving that flag like other nations might. And yet this is a time this year.
Is that Canada? Sorry.
Yeah.
Canada, all right.
Yeah. not other nations. Where we are doing that. You have said, Christy, that the Canada 150 celebrations are a slap in the face for Indigenous peoples. What do you mean specifically by that?
That we have 15,000 years of ancestry of our ancestors buried in these lands, and that it's insulting, and it's like I think I was saying to you on the phone the other day that it's like if a bunch of us jumped in a boat and went over to England and decided that we were going to rename everything, put our languages on everything, forget about everybody that lived there, take over the space with our laws, and pretty much, and then make a declaration, and then the following year celebrate the 1-year anniversary of our declaration of taking over those lands. So it's just really, it's an insult, and it's sad, and it hinders the ability for us to move forward.
Where will you be on the 1st of July?
I'm going to be in the bush. I'm going to be in the bush building a culture camp forever with Isaac Murdoch and Aaron Consmo, part of Ottoman Collective, and we are going to be completely ignoring Canada Day celebrations that are going on because they are ignoring Indigenous
I like your
people.
style.
So we're just going to go do what we need to do to try and rebuild.
One of the things that's come out of this, and we spoke about this on the radio, is Resistance 150. For people who aren't familiar with it, I guess briefly describe what it is, but also the conversations that it's led to.
It's a Twitter account, Resistance 150, and we have guest hosts on the Twitter handle, and they come on and they discuss, their nations, and when I say their nations, I mean one of their whichever nation they come from, the indigenous nation they come from, and they discuss their history of resilience and rebellion, and yeah.
Is there anything good that can come out of the 150 celebrations? Because I think a lot of people will acknowledge everything that you've just said and then say, maybe in acknowledging everything that you just said, we can use the 150 as a spring point to a better country. Do you see anything positive that can come out of the nationalism that is brewing right now?
If Canadians all got together and said, we're not going to spend the money on Canada 150 celebrations. We're going to come to you, all of the elders in the communities. We're going to walk there with tobacco and cloth in our hand, and we're going to ask you for forgiveness, and then we're going to insist that the government hands over at least half of this country. Then sure. Then sure, it'd be great.
Paul, do you think anything good can come out of this based on what you've just heard from Christy? I mean, I think you have a very different experience in this country with this country.
I think that's a hard one to answer now, Matt.
Set you up, man.
Yeah, sorry, Paul.
It's not meaning to set you up at all,
Right.
because you do have very different experiences.
You can, look, I'll give you half of the country, so, if I could. I don't know. I mean, I think these are arbitrary designations which mark passages of time, and I've always felt birthdays individually are weird, and the birthday of a country or an entity called Canada is equally weird. But I think, if viewed as an opportunity to acknowledge certain milestones along the way and things that the country has done, yeah, I think there's some value in that. And I think we also have to recognize those things that are not done, the things that have been done in our name by forebears that are horrible, and the things that are done today by us that are horrible. All of that should be bound up in all of the conversations around this arbitrary date, with a thought to what we do as we move forward.
What is being Canadian? A round of applause. What does being Canadian mean to you?
I don't really have any answer to that. And it's odd. I mean, that's a question that has been asked. I've been asked that a lot, and I'm much older than everybody on this stage, I think, so it's a very long series of questions. And I think in an earlier iteration, it was, what does it mean? What is the nature of Canadian identity? Which none of us have ever been able to answer authoritatively. And I think that in a way, that's actually our virtue, maybe singular virtue, that we don't have a hard and fast definition of ourselves. And as a consequence, are kind of more absorbent than many other nations that I've been to. And I always find that I have a sense of the place when I'm outside of it. I don't really have a sense of it when I'm inside of it. And so I don't know that there is an answer to that.
I just wonder, I mean, in part, it's an interesting question because we hear now, certainly in the last several months, but maybe in the last year or a bit, that the world needs more Canada. And people talk about Canada in glowing terms. Malala Yousafzai was in Canada getting honorary citizenship last week and spoke in the House of Commons about this country and what this country means around the world. And you wonder how that squares with what Christy just talked about, whether we're as good as...
Well, I think that's our problem. It doesn't square. And I think that reckoning is coming and has arrived, and we have to address it. I don't think we can continue down the path we've been along. I mean, we've not looked at this. And it has been institutionalized. Yeah. I mean, to be clear, I didn't know any of my nation's history in the schools I went to. I knew a version of it that included Champlain and Jacques Cartier in the Red River settlement. But I knew it was taught almost nothing about the many people who lived here long before any Europeans showed up. I think we have to get serious about this. And I mean, as I said earlier, I'm kind of hopeful we have an opportunity to do so.
Do you know that speaks to precisely what you were talking about, how in many ways you define a nation by the people on the other side of the bayonet?
But I also think, I mean, again, I'm someone who has worked in a university system. We have a ton of Canadians. Canadians love to come to American universities, you know the deal. And what I think is interesting about this question about this 150th celebration, and also the question of the folkloric sense of what Canada means. So I hear often from my Canadian students, they pitch me a version of Canada, that Canada is so much better than the United States. But both that pitch and this 150-year celebration are perfect examples of what's going on. That one of these celebrations these are rituals to manufacture forgetting and innocence. And I think Canada has, as an essential part of its identity, Canada as an essential part of identity is the United States is a serial killer, and we're not. And that is the height of utter cynicism. And Canada does a lot of messed up work around manufacturing innocence with its national identity. And it plays out across the board. So whether it's the 150th year celebration or it's Canada projecting itself in the across the world as this wonderful alternative to the serial killer down south, it's really kind of not dealing with the reality, which is it's just the little serial killer. And it's got to get with it.
I really think you are really hitting on something, which is so much of our definition of ourselves comes in reaction to the United States, and that we are almost always complacent as a consequence. We have some problems, but boy, they're not anywhere near as big as those. And I think we really have to get off of that.
Because it's the victim.
What's the role of art in helping us get off that? Christy?
Can I just go speak to what
yes,
they were speaking to?
Absolutely.
That's what I'd like to answer to or speak to. So I really like what you both had to say there. And so this is the way that I'm looking at Brexit and the rise of nationalism and Canada and how that all fits in, is that what we're seeing now around the world is this sort of pitting of tolerant society versus intolerant society. And so we're seeing it as a rise of nationalism, as either you're on one side or you're on the other. And I think what that is that's actually a symptom or a side effect of what's really going on. And if we only look at it in terms of that term, then we're missing what's really happening. What's really happening is you look at who Trump put into cabinet. ExxonMobil CEO, right into national defense. You look at every single person that he's put in has been a multinational corporation. There's been there was an interesting report that came out of The Hague 2 days ago on Monsanto. It was called the Monsanto Tribunal. And that tribunal said that, yes, Monsanto, as a multinational corporation, is guilty of committing crimes against humanity and against the environment. But the interesting thing about that report was they said that multinational corporations, coupled with the rise of neoliberalism, the world monetary system of insatiable growth, so the appetite for the world's resources, the push towards free trade, and the deregulation of environmental safeguards and protections from governments is what is really contributing to climate change and all of the things that we see happening. So how does that feed into like white supremacy and stuff? The way that I see it is that what they're doing is the corporations, the multinational corporations, have taken out the middleman of lobbyists. They want to be in government. That's what they want to be, and that's what they're doing right now. They're putting themselves into government to make those kinds of decisions, to deregulate the environment. And they're feeding the people. The people are feeling squeezed. I'm feeling squeezed. You're feeling squeezed. We're all feeling squeezed. We're feeling squeezed because we don't feel like there's enough to go around for everybody, but there is. There's more than enough to go around for everybody. But they keep feeding this illusion that there isn't enough to go around for everybody. So some people feel that the best thing to do is open up the borders. Some people feel that the best thing to do is close them off. And of course, we have to fight white supremacy at every turn. And that will exist whether or not this is going on.
So
but if we know that multinational corporations are the puppet masters, and we focus on that, because this world economy of insatiable growth is what is really at the heart of the matter, and that's the way I'm looking at it.
So, as an artist, what is your role? Because I think it's really important. You all have very loud voices as artists. As an artist, what is your role that you think is different than the media, different than politicians, to get the information that you want out? So, to counter what you see is happening out there.
I think no good revolution can happen without revolutionary art. But I think that the role of the artist, or maybe perhaps what we do naturally, I think, is seek the truth. And in this kind of world where what Paul was referring to is like we feel like we're in a tilt-a-whirl. We feel like we're gone crazy. I mean, Donald Trump is gaslighting the world. And this is what's happening, and we feel crazy. You wake up, you're like, I don't feel like things are right in the world. And so I think that seeking the truth, projecting the truth, speaking the truth, the truth of love, the truth of compassion, the truth of kindness. Greed is consuming the world, and the antidote to greed is to give. The antidote to greed is to be kind, to be compassionate. And that's the truth that we all crave.
David, is the work that you do and the art that you create for you, is that inherently political?
I think that all art forms are political. I think in some way, I think they just manifest a position. I think it's really, really beautiful listening to this conversation, and I'm sort of trying to now imagine what the world could be like, because it kind of compels you to kind of think about what what could be, what is the world, what could the world be, and that could be quite an extraordinary image.
And what your role is in that too, in helping to shape that, right?
Well, I think then the role moves away from, I mean, much of my business as an architect, architecture has become really consumed by sort of neo-capitalist kind of agendas. It's really very much driven by markets, and where those of us who are interested are very much trying to fight for a position whereby the making of structures that informs kind of, or concretizes the ideas that we have in our society are not simply just to do with market forces, but to do with ideals that we still, as architects, believe in something that's more than just the market. And that's kind of, in a way, the people I respect in my art form are all about that. We're all about finding ways of creating, remaking the image so it's not collapsing. We don't want the image to collapse, but it's a very traumatic kind of situation right now because we have, I mean, there are lots of issues going on. Apart from coming together in this idea of nations, there's also this little thing called the kind of population explosion. Like we are like becoming a huge species on this planet. We're going to be very big, and we need to consume more. And in fact, I think that the central issue becomes about what is the relationship that we're going to have with nature, and how we're going to kind of, as it were, find a kind of balance, because essentially that's what it comes down to. It's a kind of, in the end, everything I make is about a kind of consumption, and it's a trauma in my art form. My art form, I know that my art form probably consumes more and destroys more in the world.
And you feel personally like
it's a
divided?
Kind of,
you feel
yeah, it's a horrible thing.
In
It feels a little bit like there's a bit of blood on your hands every time you make something.
How do you reconcile that?
It's a horrible thing. But so each time one makes, for me, the responsibility of making is deeply, profoundly related to a political, social position. It needs to kind of do more than just be consumption.
That idea of blood on your hands it's really powerful, because it's the work that you're doing, the work that you love, but at the same time you see the effect of it, and you see the tail of it.
That's the only way I can feel good about waking up and doing it again and again. Yeah.
You've talked about the need for slow lenses to reflect what it is that's going on, Junot. That you can have a hot take, people can write things very quickly, but there's also a real advantage to seeing something and taking time and watching it evolve and then reflecting it back. Do you see that happening now? Do you see writers absorbing what's going on and then figuring out how to process it and put it back out?
I think it would be very, very hard in this society to resist the temptation not to become a very good neoliberal subject, which means that you're supposed to produce art and you're supposed to produce work at the rate of a machine. The students I work with, their dreams, what they aspire most to is to have a resume that looks like the Terminator lived it, where it's just nonstop art, work all the time. It's hard to imagine where the human element of that comes in. I myself believe that one of the important functions of art with truth-telling is that art is supposed to, well, at least for me, the art that I enjoy, it's supposed to put us in touch with that vulnerable human self, which we cover up with all sorts of mythologies and lies and obfuscations and boasts, that there's a part of us that's incredibly vulnerable and incredibly human and incredibly fragile, and that's who we really, really are. The part of us that doesn't look cute in the mirror, that doesn't have a great job, who's like, X, Y, and Z. And the way that art can obliterate all our little lies that we tell about ourselves and put us in touch with what really matters about being a human being, how absolutely evanescent this experience is of being human, how profoundly mortal we are. And in a society like ours, which teaches us to be facile, to be fast, to be cute, if you fall for that crap, you're gonna miss what matters most about yourself. which is that who we are is very complex, very difficult to get at. We have an enormous amount of defenses. Art has been perhaps the most perfect instrument, the most perfect felicity that we've created to put us in communion with that part of ourselves that we bury beneath all our lies. Yet art, both in its elaboration and in our contact with it, is not something that you can dispense of by swiping right. One needs a relationship to art. One needs to sit in art. And I do believe that not only among us as human beings, but also in our relationship to art, if we don't have long processes, we lose what matters about the conversation. A person cannot mean in 5 seconds. A person cannot mean in 3 months. To even begin to approach a friend requires a tremendous amount of time and also just a lot of deliberate care and listening. And it's the same with art. If you're just reading a book to just consume it and check it off on your Facebook, cool, do it. But there's another way to make it a part of who you are, to make it have a permanent place in you so that it continues its conversation beyond the point of your consumption of it. I think that is what leads to much more generative place for us to be people and for us to understand art's power.
Paul, you were nodding. That's incredible. I love that. You were nodding, Paul, as he was talking there. You were nodding as he was talking about that immersive effect of art. What is it that it can do in that moment, the moment that we're in right now, do you think, to try and not just reflect, but perhaps create some sort of healing?
Well, I'm not sure. And I mean, everything I've ever done really is because it's something that I'm curious about or something that I don't understand and that has wormed its way inside me, and I feel the need to, I mean, I know I won't rest until I do something about it. It's all extremely personal. So I don't have there's not an objective with anything. It's really to try to understand something.
So is there a political element to your art?
I think all art inevitably in one way or another is political, because you put it into society, society is politic, and as a consequence it has to be political. I don't have a cause that I'm pushing with the stuff I'm doing, because it really is quite kind of, I'm inside my own head, and I'm working on to understand something. I consume art in that way too, that I'm curious about something and I need to have this, as we use the word communion. That's the only way I really can understand other people, is through art.
Are there things that art can do, this is the question that I asked Christy as well, are there things that art can do that politics, that journalism, that the media can't, in terms of expressing something about the time that we're in?
Yes, I think that art utterly can always express something deep about the intimate lives of us in this society in a way that nothing else can. It can bring us to one another. And I think that that's certainly going to be, I'm really interested to see the things that are going to start to emerge in this new time that we're in. Yeah, I think it is something that makes us, art is capable of making us love each other. I don't know that politics can do that.
You wrote, we're almost out of time, but I want to get to something that you wrote in the New Yorker last fall, right after the election, Junot, and it was a piece called Radical Hope, which is amazing. What is radical hope to you?
Well, that's based on the work of Jonathan Lear, who was a philosopher, and he was thinking about what kind of imaginary is required. And he was specifically focusing on indigenous communities and what kind of imaginary is required to confront colossal, terrible loss and still imagine a future. And so for him, his ideas around this is this concept of radical hope, this idea that the ability to imagine a future goodness, a future good ending beyond and above anything that the present could ever speak to. And certainly as a person of African descent, you know, I'm always thinking, for a really long time, white people used to own my people. For a really long time, it was unimaginable that we could even have the choice of who we could love, of what we could eat, of whether I can take a day off. And I kind of connected to radical hope because certainly my ancestors dreamed and hoped that there would be people like me, that there would be us, the descendants, who would have these moments in these spaces. And they survived because even though they couldn't see a future where there could be a black president or there could be this like mulatto kid who was a writer, still it was possible for them to imagine that. And so me, radical hope is linked to that.
You wrote, we always knew this shit wasn't going to be easy. In that, what is it that gives you, I mean, it's easy in the course of the conversation that we've just had, it's easy to be weighted down by what's going on and not see the hope. What is it that allows you to see the little bit of light in that radical hope?
For me, it's real simple that my ancestors took everything that white supremacy threw at them and broke it in half. That my ancestors faced all the worst things that white supremacy could cook up to try to destroy and dehumanize us. And not only did we break them, but we didn't do it in a way that was vengeful and completely spiteful. If you think about what happened, is that we gave back the world genius. We gave back, as people of African descent, we gave back genius, we gave back art, we gave back song, we gave back body, we gave back design. And I just gotta look backwards every now and then and be like, if they could do that, this is light work. This is light work, but it only feels that way if you look to your ancestors. If this is the only moment that you have to compare, you'll feel despair and you'll feel overwhelmed, you know?
On the tilt-a-whirl, Paul, what gives you that sense of equilibrium, that sense of hope as an artist? Not just as a human being, but as somebody who creates art.
What gives me hope?
Yeah.
Well, I think we're better than the period we're in. And I have to continue to believe that human beings are just better than the period that we're in. I mean, I think it's not, false hope, but I think we've also, we know enough of history to know this is a perilous, potentially very perilous time. So I remain hopeful. I don't know the alternative is too bleak to me.
David, for you? I mean, it's personal to you as well, what you just talked about, but it's larger than that. What is it as a creator that's giving you that light?
I think that the conversation is still open, that we're still engaging, that even though things are closing, there's also a lot of things opening. I think that we're learning about each other. We're actually encountering each other in a kind of a proximity now that's never been before. And I think that even though this seems like there's a kind of retrenchment, I actually think that I sort of feel incredibly hopeful in the long term about hearing conversations like this and hearing that this is actually just a microcosm of a lot of conversations that are happening all over the planet, that there's a yearning to break out of this kind of this structure and to get to something that gets us back to something that fulfills the idea of being human on this planet. Mm-hmm.
Christy, last word to you.
What gives me hope is young people. What gives me hope is the new generations, because they're filled with passion. They're filled with a desire and a clarity, and they're not so easily fooled. What gives me hope are those young people that have tied themselves to pipelines and who have put their bodies on the line for our environment, for our water. I think we're on the cusp of a worldwide water revolution, and I think that it's all of us who are going to change and make a different, brighter future, like what David said, to imagine to imagine a better world and to shape our world and not let the evil monsters and bastards of the world do it for us, but for us to do it. And to that end, since you gave me the last word, I brought gifts for everybody. So, water is sacred, no pipelines. There it is. There we go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's artwork by Isaac Murdoch.
While you do that, what a pleasure to have you here. We could talk for hours and hours and hours, and in some ways it feels like we went really deep, and in some ways it feels like we just started into the conversation. I hope it goes out into the streets of Toronto on a beautiful thank you Friday night and through the weekend as well. Thank you all for being here. What an amazing night. And please, again, a round of applause for 4 extraordinary people. And Junot Diaz, Paul Gross, Christy Belcourt, and David Adjey. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. What a pleasure. Thank you.
Stand up.
All right.
Thank you.